Have you ever walked into a room and suddenly forgotten why you were there? Maybe you opened the refrigerator, stood there for a few seconds, and couldn't remember what you wanted. Perhaps you forgot someone's name during a conversation, only to remember it a few minutes later. Most people smile, laugh, and say the same thing: "I'm just getting older." But what if one of those ordinary senior moments wasn't quite as ordinary as it seemed? What if your brain had been trying to tell you something months, or even years, before anyone noticed there was a real problem? And more importantly, how would you know the difference between normal aging and the early warning signs of dementia? That's exactly what we're going to explore today, because here's something neurologists often emphasize that surprises many families. Growing older is normal. Occasionally, forgetting where you placed your glasses is normal. Taking a little longer to remember a word can also be normal, but repeatedly struggling with memory, thinking, or daily tasks in ways that interfere with everyday life is not considered a normal part of aging and deserves medical evaluation. Now, before we continue, let's clear up one of the biggest misconceptions. Dementia is not a single disease. It's a general term for a group of conditions that affect memory, thinking, reasoning, language, and the ability to perform everyday activities. There are several causes of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and others. Some conditions that resemble dementia, such as vitamin deficiencies, medication side effects, thyroid disorders, depression, sleep disorders, or infections, may even be treatable. That's why recognizing changes early is so important. Not because every memory problem means dementia, but because ignoring persistent changes may delay identifying the real cause. And I especially want you to stay with me until the end, because the final warning sign is one that many families overlook completely. In fact, countless people assume it's simply a personality change, when it may actually deserve medical attention. Before we begin, I'd love to know your age and where you're watching from. Leave a comment below, because it's encouraging to see people taking an active interest in protecting their brain health. And if you enjoy practical, evidence-informed videos about healthy aging, memory, and wellness, consider subscribing for more content like this. Now, let's begin with the sign that almost everyone notices first, or at least thinks they notice. Have you ever repeated the same question twice without realizing it? Maybe you asked your spouse what time your appointment was, then asked again only 5 minutes later. Perhaps someone gently reminded you, "You already asked me that." You laughed. You apologized, and then you forgot about it. Occasional forgetfulness happens to everyone. In fact, stress, poor sleep, anxiety, certain medications, and even dehydration can temporarily affect memory. But early dementia often looks different. Instead of simply forgetting a detail, a person may repeatedly forget recently learned information, important conversations, or appointments even after being reminded. They may ask the same question several times because the answer never becomes stored in memory. Think of your brain like a library. In healthy aging, finding the correct book may take a little longer. You know the book is there, eventually you find it. With dementia, the challenge is often different. Sometimes the book was never placed on the shelf in the first place. That's why repeating the same questions can become one of the earliest clues noticed by family members. One retired accountant began asking his daughter what day she planned to visit. She answered every evening. The following morning, he asked again by afternoon. The same question returned. At first, everyone blamed stress. Then they blamed aging. Months later, after discussing the changes with his physician, further evaluation revealed mild cognitive impairment, a condition that sometimes, but not always, progresses to dementia. The important lesson wasn't that repeating questions automatically means dementia. It absolutely doesn't. Many conditions can affect memory. The important lesson was recognizing that persistent change deserves professional evaluation rather than assumptions. Here's another way to think about it. Forgetfulness becomes more concerning when it starts interfering with daily life. Missing important appointments, repeatedly paying the same bill, forgetting recent conversations, depending heavily on written reminders for tasks that were once effortless. Those are the kinds of changes worth discussing with a healthcare professional. Now, here's something many families describe. The person doesn't seem to realize anything is changing. Instead, the family notices first, and that brings us to the second warning sign, one that often creates confusion because it doesn't look like memory loss at all. Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation and suddenly couldn't remember a very familiar word? Perhaps you wanted to say television, but instead you said that box over there. Everyone occasionally struggles to find the right word. That's perfectly normal. The difference lies in how often it happens and whether it begins interfering with communication. People in the early stages of some forms of dementia may pause frequently while speaking, they may substitute unusual words, they may lose track of conversations, or they may stop speaking mid-sentence because they can no longer remember what they wanted to say. Imagine trying to complete a puzzle in normal aging. One piece takes longer to find. In dementia, several important pieces may suddenly seem to disappear. One 76-year-old retired teacher, famous for telling wonderful stories, gradually began replacing common words with descriptions. Instead of saying, "watch," she said, "the thing that tells time." Instead of saying, "refrigerator," she called it, "the cold cupboard." Her family initially thought it was harmless. After all, everyone forgets words sometimes. But as the months passed, those pauses became more frequent. Simple conversations became frustrating. She often abandoned stories halfway through because she couldn't remember what she wanted to say next. After evaluation, her physician explained that language difficulties can sometimes be one of the early cognitive changes associated with certain types of dementia. Again, not always, but sometimes. That's why patterns matter much more than isolated moments. One forgotten word means very little. Hundreds of forgotten words developing over months tell a very different story. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever known someone who could remember events from 40 years ago in remarkable detail, yet couldn't remember what happened yesterday afternoon? That unusual contrast surprises many families. Long-term memories often remain stronger during the earlier stages of some dementias than recent memories. Someone may vividly describe their wedding day, military service, or childhood home, yet forget a conversation that happened earlier that morning, and that difference often becomes one of the earliest clues loved ones begin noticing. But here's where today's discussion becomes even more surprising, because the next warning sign doesn't involve memory, it doesn't involve language. And many families mistake it for simple stubbornness. In reality, neurologists say it can sometimes appear years before a formal diagnosis. Now let me ask you something that might seem completely unrelated to memory. Have you ever watched a loved one struggle to make a simple cup of coffee? Not because they forgot what coffee was, but because they suddenly couldn't remember the steps. They stand in the kitchen staring at the coffee maker they've used for years. They know it belongs to them. They know they've used it thousands of times. Yet for some reason the sequence no longer makes sense. At first, everyone assumes they're distracted. They're tired. Maybe they just didn't sleep well, but what if the real problem isn't memory? What if it's the brain's ability to organize familiar tasks? This brings us to another early warning sign that neurologists pay close attention to: difficulty completing familiar activities. Notice the word familiar. We're not talking about learning a brand new smartphone or figuring out a complicated computer program. Anyone can struggle with something new. We're talking about activities that were once automatic: preparing breakfast, following a favorite recipe, managing monthly bills, operating the TV remote they've used for years, playing a familiar card game, driving the usual route to the grocery store. These are tasks performed hundreds or even thousands of times throughout life. When they suddenly become confusing without another clear explanation, it's worth paying attention. Think about driving home from work. You've done it so many times that your brain barely has to think about each turn. Now imagine reaching an intersection you've crossed for 20 years and suddenly wondering, which way do I go? That moment would probably surprise you. One isolated episode could happen to anyone, but when moments like that begin occurring repeatedly, they deserve medical attention. One retired mechanic had rebuilt engines for more than 40 years. Friends admired his ability to solve almost any mechanical problem. Then something unusual began happening. He stood in his garage looking at a lawnmower he had repaired dozens of times before. He knew every individual part, but he couldn't remember the correct order to put them back together. His knowledge wasn't gone. His ability to organize the sequence had changed. His family initially thought he was simply distracted. Months later, after several similar experiences, they encouraged him to speak with his physician. Further evaluation revealed cognitive changes that required ongoing monitoring. The important lesson wasn't that forgetting one step means dementia. It doesn't. Stress, fatigue, medication side effects, vision problems, even depression can affect concentration. The lesson is that persistent changes involving familiar tasks should never be dismissed simply because someone is getting older. Now here's another question. Have you ever opened your checkbook or banking app and suddenly felt overwhelmed by numbers that once seemed simple? Managing finances is one of the most complex everyday activities our brains perform. It requires attention, planning, memory, judgment, and organization. That's why difficulty handling money sometimes becomes one of the earliest functional changes families notice. A person who once balanced accounts perfectly may begin paying the same bill twice. Forgetting to pay important bills, sending unusually large donations to strangers, or becoming confused by routine financial paperwork. Again, none of these automatically mean dementia, but repeated changes deserve evaluation. Now here's where things become even more surprising, because the next warning sign has nothing to do with remembering or speaking or even completing tasks. Instead, it changes the way people make decisions. Have you ever known someone who was always careful with money, then suddenly started buying expensive products from TV advertisements, giving personal information to strangers, or trusting obvious scams that they would have recognized years earlier? Families often describe this as, "Dad just isn't thinking like himself anymore." They're noticing changes in judgment. Good judgment depends on several parts of the brain working together: evaluating risks, predicting consequences, recognizing danger, comparing choices. When those abilities begin changing, everyday decisions may also change. One 79-year-old widow answered a telephone call from someone claiming to represent her bank. Within 20 minutes, she had shared personal financial information with a complete stranger. Her children were shocked. Their mother had always been extremely cautious. Looking back, they realized similar judgment problems had appeared months earlier. She had purchased unnecessary products from TV advertisements, given money to unfamiliar charities without researching them, and repeatedly trusted people she had only recently met. Each decision seemed isolated at first. Together, they formed a pattern. Neurologists often remind families that changes in judgment can sometimes appear before severe memory problems become obvious. That's one reason loved ones are frequently the first people to recognize subtle changes. Now, let me ask you something even more personal. Have you ever noticed someone becoming unusually suspicious for no clear reason? Perhaps they begin accusing family members of stealing items, even though those items are later found inside their own home, or they insist neighbors are entering the house, despite no evidence that anyone has been there. These situations can be heartbreaking, not because the person is intentionally being difficult, but because the brain may genuinely be struggling to interpret reality accurately. One retired librarian repeatedly accused her daughter of stealing her purse. Arguments became frequent. Trust began disappearing. Weeks later, the purse was discovered inside a kitchen cabinet behind several pots. The daughter wasn't angry anymore, she was worried. That single discovery changed the entire conversation. Instead of asking, "Why are you acting this way?" she began asking, "Could something medical be happening?" That question led to an appointment, and that appointment led to answers. Now here's something families often overlook. People experiencing early cognitive decline aren't usually pretending. They aren't trying to create conflict. From their perspective, what they're saying often feels completely real. Responding with patience instead of frustration can make an enormous difference while seeking proper medical evaluation. But here's where today's discussion takes another unexpected turn, because the next warning sign doesn't happen inside the home. It often appears outside, during activities people have enjoyed for decades. And surprisingly, many families mistake it for nothing more than getting older. Now, let me ask you something that many families don't notice until they look back months later. Have you ever known someone who used to be incredibly social, always the first to call friends, attend family gatherings, or enjoy hobbies they had loved for years, and then, little by little, they began pulling away from everything? They stopped attending church. They no longer wanted to play cards with friends. They gave up gardening. They stopped answering phone calls. Everyone assumed they were simply slowing down with age. But what if the real reason was something much deeper? Social withdrawal can happen for many reasons: depression, hearing loss, chronic pain, anxiety, mobility problems, the loss of a spouse. All of these are common and important possibilities. However, neurologists also recognize that some people in the early stages of dementia begin avoiding social situations because conversations, decision-making, and keeping up with others gradually become more difficult. Imagine sitting around a dinner table where everyone is talking at once. Years ago, you followed every conversation with ease. Now you're struggling to remember names, keep track of who said what, or find the right words quickly enough to join in. Instead of feeling relaxed, you begin feeling embarrassed. Eventually, staying home seems easier than trying to keep up. One retired businessman had never missed his weekly breakfast with friends for nearly 20 years. Then, almost without anyone noticing, he began making excuses. "I'm a little tired today. Maybe next week. I don't feel like driving at first. His friends respected his decision, but months passed. The excuses became more frequent. When his daughter visited, she noticed something unusual. It wasn't that he had lost interest in his friends. He seemed worried that he couldn't follow conversations the way he once had. After a medical evaluation, doctors identified early cognitive changes that helped explain why social situations had become so overwhelming. The important lesson is this: people don't always withdraw because they no longer care. Sometimes they withdraw because they're quietly struggling with changes they don't fully understand themselves. Now, here's another question. Have you ever watched someone repeatedly lose everyday objects in places that made absolutely no sense? Everyone misplaces things, keys disappear, reading glasses seem to vanish, the TV remote somehow ends up under a pillow. That's normal, but there's a difference between misplacing something and placing it somewhere completely unusual while forgetting how it got there. Imagine opening your freezer and finding your wallet, or discovering the TV remote inside the medicine cabinet, or your eyeglasses inside the sugar container. These aren't simply moments of forgetfulness. They may suggest difficulty organizing information and retracing recent actions. One 77-year-old grandmother became convinced someone was entering her home and stealing her belongings. Her family searched everywhere. Days later, they discovered her purse inside the washing machine. The following week, they found the house keys inside a cereal box. A month later, her reading glasses appeared in the refrigerator. Each event by itself seemed strange. Together they formed a pattern that encouraged the family to seek medical advice. Again, this doesn't automatically mean dementia, medication side effects, stress, depression, sleep disorders, and several other medical conditions can also contribute to confusion. That's exactly why medical evaluation matters. The goal isn't to jump to conclusions. The goal is to understand why these changes are happening. Now here's something even more surprising. Have you ever noticed someone becoming confused about the date, the season, or where they are, not simply forgetting whether today is Tuesday or Wednesday? Everyone does that occasionally. We're talking about becoming genuinely disoriented, forgetting how they arrived somewhere familiar, not recognizing a route they've driven for years, or believing they're living in a different period of their life. One retired postal worker drove to the grocery store he had visited every week for more than 15 years. After finishing his shopping, he suddenly couldn't remember how to get home. He sat in the parking lot feeling frightened. Fortunately, he called his son, who guided him home safely. When the family later discussed the incident, they realized it wasn't the first unusual event. There had been several smaller memory changes during the previous year. Each had seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a much clearer picture. Neurologists often explain that orientation depends on several different brain functions working together: memory, attention, visual processing, planning. When these systems begin changing, familiar places may unexpectedly become confusing. Now let me ask you one more question. Have you ever looked at a loved one and quietly thought, they just don't seem like themselves anymore? Not because they forgot something, not because they got lost, but because their personality seemed different. Perhaps someone who was once patient became unusually irritable. Someone who loved conversation became unusually quiet. Someone who was always confident suddenly became fearful. Or someone known for kindness became unexpectedly suspicious. Families often assume these changes are simply part of getting older. But neurologists say personality and behavioral changes can sometimes be among the earliest noticeable symptoms in certain types of dementia. One retired nurse had always been warm, cheerful, and outgoing. Over several months, her family noticed she became increasingly anxious over very small problems. She worried constantly about things that had never bothered her before. She became suspicious of neighbors. She reacted with unusual anger when anyone tried to help her. The family initially believed she was simply under stress. Only later did they learn that behavioral changes can sometimes appear alongside cognitive changes. The important point isn't to diagnose someone based on personality alone. Life events can absolutely change mood. Depression, anxiety, grief, chronic illness, and medication effects can all influence behavior. What matters is recognizing persistent changes that represent a clear departure from someone's lifelong personality. Because the earlier these patterns are evaluated, the sooner families can understand what's really happening. But here's what neurologists say may be the most important message of today's entire video. The final sign isn't something you notice in one day. It's something you only recognize after connecting all the small changes together. Now, let me ask you one final question. What if the biggest mistake families make isn't missing one warning sign, but failing to connect all of the small changes together. Think about it for a moment. One forgotten appointment doesn't necessarily mean anything serious. One misplaced set of keys can happen to anyone. One bad day, one confusing conversation, or one missed word is simply part of being human. But what happens when those small moments slowly begin appearing together? The repeated questions, the difficulty finding familiar words, the confusion while completing everyday tasks, poor judgment, social withdrawal, misplacing objects in unusual places, losing track of time or familiar locations, personality changes individually. Each may have many possible explanations together. They create a pattern that deserves medical attention. This is exactly why neurologists rarely diagnose dementia based on a single symptom. Instead, they look for progressive changes over time that begin interfering with everyday independence. Think of your brain like an orchestra. When every musician is playing together, the music sounds beautiful. If one instrument misses a single note, the audience barely notices. But if more and more instruments gradually begin falling out of rhythm, eventually everyone recognizes that something has changed. The brain works in much the same way. Memory doesn't work alone. Language doesn't work alone. Judgment, planning, attention, problem-solving, orientation, they all work together. When several of these abilities gradually begin changing at the same time, physicians know it's important to investigate further. One 80-year-old grandfather spent nearly 2 years insisting nothing was wrong. His family noticed small changes. He repeated stories during the same conversation. He forgot birthdays he had remembered for decades. He stopped attending family gatherings. He misplaced important documents. He became unusually suspicious whenever someone tried to help organize his medications. No single event seemed dramatic. Together, they completely changed his daily life. Finally, his daughter scheduled an appointment with his primary care physician. That appointment led to neurological testing. The testing eventually identified early Alzheimer's disease. Although there was no cure, receiving a diagnosis allowed the family to begin treatment, review medications, create a long-term care plan, improve home safety, and discuss future decisions while he could still actively participate. His daughter later shared something she wished every family understood. "I wish we had asked for help sooner instead of explaining everything away as normal aging," and perhaps that's the most important message in today's entire video. Early evaluation doesn't only help identify dementia. Sometimes it reveals something entirely different. Vitamin B12 deficiency, medication side effects, thyroid disorders, depression, sleep apnea, hearing loss, normal pressure hydrocephalus. Even infections or dehydration in older adults can sometimes cause sudden confusion. Some of these conditions are treatable. Others can be significantly improved when identified early. That's why guessing at home is never the answer. Professional evaluation is. Now let's quickly review the 9 early warning signs we've discussed today. Repeatedly forgetting recently learned information or asking the same questions again and again, increasing difficulty finding familiar words or following conversations, trouble completing everyday tasks that were once automatic, poor judgment or unusual financial decisions, withdrawing from hobbies, friends, or social activities, frequently placing objects in unusual locations and being unable to retrace your steps, confusion about time, familiar places, or well-known routes. Noticeable personality or behavioral changes that represent a significant departure from someone's lifelong character. And finally, recognizing that it's the combination and progression of these changes, not one isolated incident that matters most. Notice something incredibly important: none of these signs automatically means someone has dementia. Every one of them has multiple possible explanations. The goal of today's video isn't fear, it's awareness. Because awareness leads to earlier conversations. Earlier conversations lead to earlier evaluations, and earlier evaluations provide the best opportunity to identify treatable conditions, begin appropriate care, and help families prepare for the future. If you notice persistent changes in yourself or someone you love, don't ignore them and don't try to diagnose them yourself. Schedule an appointment with a healthcare professional who can perform a thorough evaluation and determine the underlying cause. And if someone you care about is experiencing memory changes, remember something equally important: patience matters. Correcting them harshly rarely helps. Arguing about forgotten events usually creates frustration. Approaching the situation with kindness, understanding, and compassion often makes an enormous difference for both the individual and the family. The brain is one of the most extraordinary organs in the human body. It stores your memories, recognizes the faces of the people you love, guides every conversation, every decision, every dream, and every treasured moment of your life. Protecting it begins long before symptoms ever appear. regular physical activity, quality sleep, managing blood pressure, diabetes, and cholesterol, staying socially active, keeping your mind engaged, eating a balanced diet, taking medications exactly as prescribed, and seeking medical advice whenever something doesn't feel right. These simple habits may not guarantee perfect brain health, but they remain some of the most important ways to support healthy aging. If you found today's video helpful, consider subscribing for more evidence-informed videos about healthy aging, memory, brain health, and practical wellness tips designed to help you make informed decisions alongside your healthcare team. And before you leave, I'd love to hear from you. How old are you? And which of today's 9 warning signs surprised you the most? Have you ever noticed any of these changes in yourself or a loved one? Leave your answer in the comments below. Your story could encourage someone else to seek help at exactly the right time. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourself, stay curious, stay connected with the people you love, and I'll see you in the next video.